Hi there, this is Bob Coppage with BizTech Twist, CEO of Simplex-IT, Grand Poobah, Crotchety Old Geek, whatever you want to call it. And I'm joined on the latest episode of BizTech Twist with Paul DePronio with Operations Management Consulting. Paul, thanks for joining.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
We'll see. We'll see. It's a pleasure for everybody else until they talk to me. But that's how that goes. So, Paul, give us a little bit of background on you.
Well, my background is been for a number of years in the corporate world and in operations, primarily in distribution and back office. And after I was laid off in 2019, I got into consulting. And since then, I've been helping companies really help them build their infrastructure for the future and also for the present. Generally small to mid-sized companies, and helping them in the distribution centers or streamlining their back office. So,
and that's interesting because when we talk about redefining and all that kind of fun stuff, and whether we talk back office distribution, because the supply chain definition is completely been redone between COVID and everything else.
Yeah, and it keeps changing every day. A year ago we were talking about shortages everywhere, and now we're hearing that everybody's overstocked.
Yeah, and the thing is that that's not just from we always talk about it from the supply chain standpoint, but it's also from the consumer standpoint, because a lot of organizations ended up buying a lot more excess inventory than they needed.
Right.
And especially organizations that were existing with the just-in-time concept, which of course was everybody's go-to definition.
Right.
Now it's no, you need it now because you never know.
Exactly.
The pendulum swings.
I mean, my wife, I think we still have paper towels she bought during the pandemic.
Yeah, you're the one.
Up, right, yeah. So there's a reason for that.
Oh, absolutely. And from our standpoint, because I'll talk about my wife too, because we're both going to be in trouble now, is we now buy everything through Amazon.
That's right.
And so, that whole supply process has eliminated several points in that supply chain and distribution. And one of the things, and this gets indirectly to the topic of that you and I started talking about offline, or actually online, is organizations' use of automation.
That's right. And
because we're all looking for ways to do more with less, however you want to define that. And of course, the buzzword automation. No, we're not going to go AI. No. But from an automation standpoint, we often talk about it from the technical implementation. Here are the tools we're going to use. Here's the way that we're going to use cloud technology or on-prem technology or whatever to do automation. But we don't really talk about the business side of it, the human side. What do we automate? What do we not automate? And that's kind of where our conversation went. That's why I thought this would be an interesting topic.
Yeah, and it is interesting because a lot of companies think they need to automate, yet they don't have any repeatable processes in place today. They don't have a workforce that's properly trained. They don't have the physical setup they need to run their business, yet they want to jump to automation. And you're setting yourself up for failure unless you have the basics covered.
So let's start right off the top with repeatable process. What do you define for an organization? And let's keep this over on the small, medium size organization. Repeatable process. Why is that term important, and what does it mean?
So, it's important for a small business. Let's say you have 10 people in the business and 4 of them work in the distribution part of their business. And if Sally normally does your receiving, and if Sally's on vacation or out, there are a lot of small businesses that won't receive for the 2 weeks that Sally's out. And that's incredibly dangerous. Or someone will receive and they miss part of the process, and that inventory that's received in doesn't get into the system properly, doesn't get put away properly. So part of a repeatable process is that more than one person has to be aware of how to do it, and ideally, and it's rare, but it should be documented. And as the process changes, that documentation is updated. So anyone, with some basic information on how their systems work should be able to receive or put away or pick product and keep inventory right.
So one of the things that, from the IT standpoint, we often would talk about single points of failure.
Right.
If this piece of equipment, if this piece of software, this piece of infrastructure fails, then that's going to have a cascading effect through the organization. But what we often don't do is we often don't think about single points of failure from a human standpoint.
Right.
If Sally were to leave the company entirely, what would happen?
Right.
Because there's that tribal knowledge, and sometimes tribal knowledge is one person knows it and everybody knows that person is Sally.
Right.
Or everybody knows it, but they don't know it consistently.
Right. And oftentimes when Sally does leave, then that means, the president or the owner or whoever it is ends up receiving, and they don't know what they're doing either because they haven't done it for.
Right. Or they're going to do it the way they did it 20 years ago.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And create more problems. And now they're not focusing on what they should be doing. Yeah. And it just, it becomes really nasty, right?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, at my company, Simplex-IT, because I'm out of the day-to-day tech world. And there is actually, and I've talked about this many times, both in the podcast as well as publicly, there's a whiteboard that says things Bob is not allowed to touch. And that's because my knowledge is out of date.
Right.
Whether it be technical knowledge for the business or the operational or procedural knowledge.
Yeah.
So when we talk about repeatable process, we talk about documentation, and that's tough to sell, especially for those companies of 10 people.
Right.
How do we approach that conversation?
Sometimes it doesn't have to be anything fancy, right?
Right.
It could be 8, 10 bullet points on a piece of paper that you slide into a plastic sleeve.
Right.
It's just something, that you need to do to get going. It's no more than following a recipe, mm-hmm. right? And I try to explain to small businesses, we're just putting recipes out there so your people can bake a consistent cake.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be fancy. If you want to get fancy, we can get fancy, but it's really the high level points that you can't take a shortcut on, whether it's receiving something in or how do you ship a UPS package. Mm-hmm. If they miss a piece of that process, that package likely won't get out, or the tracking won't get into your system so that you can follow it up for a customer.
But the challenge you have on that is, when you go to a company and you say, do you have standards? And they say, oh, we have plenty of standards,
right.
But they're not consistent.
Right.
So part of it is to get everybody on board to say, we're all going to document in this form,
right.
or in this document. And it could be we've got a SharePoint library, right. or shared document or anything along those lines. Just that's where you put it.
Right.
And that usually starts with management or some type of leadership who says, yeah, this is important. We're going to do that.
Right. And, it all starts at the top. If folks at the top don't think it's important, it's not going to be important to
right.
the guy in the warehouse.
Yeah.
And if it's important to the president, and he or she follows up with that and make sure that it's happening and explain. Really, the thing is to explain why. Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
If people know the why, they're much more likely to buy in than just to be told to do something.
Yeah, I do think that the why is one of the most underutilized questions in business. Is they all are so often with the what are we going to do, where are we going to do it, how are we going to do it, when are we going to do it, and then we forget about the why.
Right.
And that is such a critical thing for buy-in for people, especially if you're going to say you need to document something, which by definition means we want your productivity to slow down.
Right.
Because you're going to do this as opposed to you're going to record the action as opposed to doing the action.
Right.
Or in addition to doing the action.
And I kind of liken it when I'm trying to work with small groups of people like that is it's like going to the gym. You're not going to see the results today or tomorrow or a week from now. But if you do this in 6 months when it comes time for your vacation,
right.
you can take your vacation and not have to come back to, a desk full of papers that you have to process because someone else was able to
right.
do this while you were away.
Right.
And you got to show them what's in it for them as well. And that helps with the buy-in. Now, none of this obviously happens overnight, right? It's a process. And it does start at the top, and there has to be the discipline by the leaders at the top to encourage, to comment, to be involved in the process.
Yeah, and it has to end up being part of that. Here's why you're here for 40 hours a week.
Right.
Is part of what you're here to do is you're here to document, you're here to define.
Right.
So that we can become more productive. And some people will look at that as you're asking me to give up my secrets.
Right.
That's my turf. I'm the one who created this. How do you fight that?
That's a tough one, especially when someone's been doing something for 20 years.
Right.
And again, coming in as a consultant or it's more difficult, and they have to hear that from their boss, from the organization, and help them understand that, look, this isn't a threat to your role here with us.
Yeah.
This is going to help solidify things. And we want to make it easier for you. Wouldn't it be great if you didn't have to come in on a Saturday morning every other week to catch up for 4 hours, right? Wouldn't you like that time back with your family?
Yep.
And to do some of those things and help them understand is really key here. And again, you have to be patient. And someone's been doing something the same way for 20 years. You're not going to change that mindset overnight,
right.
But it's being persistent, and it's like anything else. It's a habit that you have to change.
Yeah, and you brought up a term earlier that I always refer to as WIFM. What's in it for me? Whenever you're trying to introduce change to an organization or change to individuals, you have to combat both WIFM and NIMBY. The WIFM is essentially, here's how your life is going to improve, however you define life improvement by us implementing this change. And then also, here's how your life is going to get worse.
Right.
They're not in my backyard.
Right.
Or NIMBY. And you have to address those with people, and especially when you have people who have not been asked, where you're asking them to make significant changes to things that are near and dear to their heart.
Yeah.
You've got to effectively communicate it.
And I think also as you're going through this, because they've done things a certain way for many years, what they document, you always have to be challenging and saying, hey, is this really a necessary step?
Yep.
Is this something we really need to do? Or where can we streamline this process? Because eventually, if you do go to automation,
right,
you only want to do the things that need to get done. You don't want to add steps in there that create no value.
Oh, absolutely.
So sometimes coming in with fresh eyes, you can ask those questions because you legitimately don't know, and then they'll say, well, we've always done it, but I don't know that there's a reason. And they start asking coworkers, and before you know it, oh, well, we started doing that when Joe was here 10 years ago because here's why.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't apply anymore. So we can eliminate that. And that helps people feel like they got a couple of wins in here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting because one of my first projects, I used to be IT director at a municipality, and this is back when I was like 22 or so, and dumber than I am now, which is hard to believe. And there was a process whereby when someone applied for a job, they had to fill out, I think it was 5 different forms, for different reasons they're applying for the job, government bureaucracy and all that. So what we did was we used a word processor, and this was even before the PC, all right? So we used a word processor. We created one form for them to fill out, entered it into the word processor, and then it would print out all of the 5 forms. So instead of one person filling out 5 forms, print out one. Okay. So proud of myself because I was such a good little geek. Come by about 2 weeks later, and now it turns out they're having the people fill out 6 forms. They're still filling out the 5 original forms and now the 6th one, because the people who were just gathering the information didn't want to bother entering into a system, and instead took these 5 separate forms, and it totally eliminated any savings because we had a system, but there was no follow through, and there was no backing from management to make sure it was followed.
Right. And that's part of that feedback loop, right? What are we doing with it? Has it worked? What do we need to change?
Yeah.
Why haven't we done anything?
Yep. And I totally blew it on all those points.
Right.
So I just looked at it from one aspect.
That's how you learn, though, right?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
if you make a mistake, it's okay if you learn from it.
Well, I must be the smartest person on the freaking planet then, because I've made enough of them. So when does an organization, and we even haven't gotten into automation yet, which is interesting in and of itself. So when we want to look for savings, and you could look at savings, the do more with less concept, we could talk about that because we're going to increase efficiency, because we're going to increase quality, cut the time it takes to do tasks or do tasks we never have been able to do before. From a management standpoint, what are the things that they should look at in order for them to know, yes, automation could be a possibility, but the documentation, the definition, they've got to do something. The change is needed or definition is needed.
Right.
What are some of the warning signs?
Some of the warning signs that something needs to change is usually the company's growing, and sales are outpacing their ability to provide product or ship product or provide the services that company does. So the warning signs is that everyone's agitated because no one feels like they're able to get their job done.
Okay.
And at that point, then you have to look at, well, what's the reason for us not being able to keep up with demand? Is it a people issue? Is it a process issue? Do we not have enough? Is it a space issue? Mm-hmm. And then looking to see, okay, now what are our options to address these things? And then as you dig, you might find that they don't have their processes may be sound and they're documented, but they don't, for today's volume, they need to modify them because they don't change anymore. They might have a coffee shop and they might be extremely busy and they've got plenty of help, but they only have one espresso machine where they can make cappuccino. Mm-hmm. So, the answer there is everyone knows how to make it. They've got enough people. They've got the ingredients. They just don't have enough equipment.
Right.
And sometimes it sounds completely obvious, but you're so tied into taking care of your customer and doing everything else that, hey, maybe all we need is another espresso machine.
So how do you approach that concept? And of course, the quick answer is bring you in, okay?
Right.
And whether you look at that from a consultative standpoint or the like. But from an organization that's basically going, we used to be able to do this easy, and now we can't.
And oftentimes, you'll hear from the owner, hey, when I was doing it, I could do it all.
Yeah.
And now I have this general manager who he just doesn't get it, they go down that road.
And the general manager it's different than it was when you were doing it. So both parties are going, you don't understand.
So that's true. But when you were doing it all by yourself, it was just you and one other employee. Right. Today, you've got 30 employees and that general manager is trying to balance all these things. And you're not looking at what he or she is running up against and how to work together to solve that problem. You just have the expectation that I was able to do it, you should be able to do it.
Right.
And just kind of having them step back sometimes and just look at things objectively is very difficult.
Right. And ego's at the door.
Yeah, it is. And some, the more evolved business owner is going to be able to do that. Those that aren't, they're just going to, pull ahead. They're going to maybe fire that GM and bring somebody else in and have the same problem.
Right.
So it's not an easy thing.
Yeah.
And or the other thing that sometimes happens is that they jump back into the role and they realize that the general manager was right. We got some issues, and then they're ready to look at ways to change.
So one of the things I like in these types of situations, again, we're looking at it from the tech perspective or the like, is to do what we call the tabletop, meeting, where we try to get the parties who are involved with making the pieces and parts move, and then just walk through the process and try to identify where are the speed bumps, where are the things, the espresso machines we don't have, where are those, and try to do so in a way that nobody's criticizing anybody. We're all working hard. We're all working smart. We're all trying to do the best we can. But there's obviously some pressure points. There's obviously some places. And I like the idea, because if you can get the people, and it's tough, if you can get the people all in the same room to just walk through that procedurally or operationally, sometimes you can get people to go, well, we used to do 20 of those a day. That was easy. Now we've got 40 and we've made no additional investment. How we do it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's what you have to do. And once you understand where the bottlenecks are and you're not going to get them all, but you're going to get, a good chunk of them up on the board as to what our major issues are, where the bottlenecks are. And then from there, you got to take another step back and say, okay, this is what we're up against. In a perfect world, if we were going to redesign this process or this building, how would we set it up to eliminate the bottlenecks. I was working with a company that was doing phenomenally well, and they were growing, and they had plenty of property. So what they would do is they would add smaller buildings or bring in storage trailers, and it got to the point where they were challenged with pulling everything they needed together to get stuff out the door. And when we started peeling back the onion, it was like, well, it takes us an hour to get into one of those storage trailers to pull out this stuff. It's
and then the light goes off
right.
for everybody.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's probably not a good thing.
That's right, and that's how we kind of go down that path and get people to look at things differently.
Cool. So there are two questions I like to use in these types of situations, but I'm going to make people have to wait to hear those questions because it's commercial time. Sorry about that.
Sometimes the most effective IT support model for organizations is a combination of internal IT employees along with an MSP partner that's experienced in co-managed IT services. Consider Simplex-IT. We work in partnership with your existing IT team, providing the support and resources for your organization to excel. Plus, our CEO, Bob Coppage, is the recognized industry expert in co-managed IT services and has authored the only 2 books on the topic.
That's me.
Visit simplex-it.com and look under services to learn more.
All right. Bob Coppage again with my guest, Paul. Now, and sorry about the commercial, something we just need to do. But I did hint about having a couple of questions that I like to spring on management. And it's one of those where, because part of our job, and we're all consultants. I don't care if you're an employee of a company, if you are a consultant, if you own a company, whatever. Part of our job is to add value in conversations and discussions. And 2 of the questions that I found to be very useful is one, and kind of like what you were talking about earlier, if you were going to start from scratch, what would you do differently? Whatever process or organization. And sometimes you'll find, oh, well, we can do that differently. And then the second one is if you had a magic wand and you could change 3 things, what would they be? Because both those questions are they're cut free from the status quo, what they already have. Because there's so often when you talk about something, there's we can't do that, or that'll never work, or whatever.
We tried that before.
Yeah, exactly. So those are 2 questions that I like to use. Do you have any?
Yeah, no, those are excellent questions. And, I also like to ask people, what haven't I asked you that you would have thought I would have asked you? And, surprisingly, a lot of times people will come up with something that I never thought of.
Oh, yeah.
And it leads to a whole nother level of conversation because they might say something like, well, you never asked about our other offices. Oh, I didn't even know you had other offices. And how do they, process that order? And well, they do it totally different. And then you go down this whole other trail that's impacting the problem that you're having.
It is so critical to have that collaborative. And that doesn't mean you don't call people out when you think they're wrong or when there's an issue or contrary, but you don't do so. You I'm going to say attack the facts, not the person.
Right.
And actually you shouldn't even be attacking, period. Speaking of attacking, I'm going to attack ourselves now because we've talked about everything, but we really haven't talked about automation.
Right.
All right. And there's a reason for that. What is that reason that we haven't talked about it yet?
I really think it's because unless you're organized and you have processes in place, the right people in place to try and automate, it's going to cause even more problems.
But I'm a technology company. I just want to automate. Can't you just let me automate stuff? Come on, it's fun.
Once we're to the point where we have things running smoothly manually, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's repeatable and we're getting the job done and the stress levels are down. That's the time to start looking at how might we automate this?
Right.
And years ago, when you had to lease equipment, the leasing companies, the banks, they required an actual signature on the document and a hard copy. And that's when you would FedEx things in, right? Today, those requirements have changed, and especially with the pandemic, things have changed significantly. But there are still companies out there that, even though they don't need to do things with a hard copy anymore,
right.
They haven't migrated to the new ways that the banks will accept that documentation. So there are opportunities to to automate,
Right.
how you do those things that will streamline it for the customer, for the sales rep, and for the back office.
So, but here's the challenge. Getting back to again where we started with this whole thing is, and I'm in the IT business, which means automation is the solution to all things. Do more with less. That's the whole concept. And so often automation fails, and I would also say outsourcing fails.
Yeah.
Because automation is based on the idea that we can repeat things efficiently and effectively, and they're well defined,
Right.
which gets back to your point. And whether it's because Sally's going on vacation or we want a computer to do some of the things that Sally was doing, if whatever it was Sally was doing is not well defined, we're not going to go anywhere successfully.
That's right. And it has to be well defined. And you also have to decide how much automation you're going to implement at once.
Right.
Right. And sometimes companies make the mistake of, we want to bite off the whole apple.
Right.
We want to install a warehouse management system, all of it.
Right.
And that's great. And long term, that should be your goal. But maybe you need to take a shorter approach to this. Mm-hmm. And let's determine where our biggest pain point is right now. And maybe we use the warehouse management system we implemented, but we start with receiving.
Right.
Let people get accustomed to it. Let them build, their strengths there. And then we can move on to other areas. We can put timelines to it, and we can have a plan. We just don't want to say, well, at some point we'll implement everything. But you have to pace yourself, because if you try and do everything at once and you fail, it's going to be really hard to get that back again and implement it at some point in the future. And
part of the challenge on that is, the way I refer to that often is evolution versus revolution.
Right.
When you start implementing things piecemeal, step at a time, that's an evolutionary change. We can do that. You're introducing significant change, but only to small subsets of the organization. Whereas revolution, we're doing it all. We're doing it now.
Right.
And there are some times where revolutionary is needed.
Right. You don't have a choice sometimes.
Exactly.
You're replacing your ERP or something like that.
Right.
But you can go into that ERP replacement by making sure everyone's comfortable with the new technology, that they've been working with it, that they've tested it, that they've got their hands on it.
Yeah.
As opposed to coming in Monday morning and, here's a new ERP.
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of like, or the example that I would use is a bit more pedestrian, is, you don't evolutionary add a new car.
Right.
You buy the new car.
Right.
That said, there's a difference between, like you're saying, doing an ERP system or something for an entire organization. So, but let's talk about specifically on automation on a tactical level. So an organization is looking for things, and let's say they've gone through at least a preliminary review of their processes, their documents, their procedures, and they are looking to now start using the automation word.
Right. And
start reviewing. How do they look for things? And again, I don't want to get too into depth or detail, because the technology behind automation is deep and wide. There's lots of ways to do it. But how do you look for the opportunities to automate?
I think it's where technology and whatever you're trying to automate can simplify things for people and make it less painful. Mm-hmm. As an example, a lot of places, when they get hardware in, it's serialized, or equipment in, they have to key in all those serial numbers.
Right.
And it's so easy, even if you're careful, to think an O is a 0 or vice versa, and to make a keystroke mistake, which causes all kinds of problems down the road. So from an automation standpoint, okay, well, this one makes sense. How can we scan that information off the box that comes in from the manufacturer to get it in our system? And no one's going to fight that, because everyone hates keying things in to that extent.
Right.
And then correcting the problem when it's identified 6 months down the road at customer site.
Yep. And that should be something that should be a relatively natural extension of however they're recording the stuff now.
Right.
So you're basically recording or replacing a manual process with still a manual process, but with a good part of it, replaced with a barcode gun instead of the the keys. And that's something that a person doesn't have to be a technology genius to see that opportunity. That person would just look and say, I do a lot of this.
Right.
And so you can actually go out and ask your employees, what do you do a lot of?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And I think another thing is to dumb it down so that everyone can understand it. A lot of times technology for most people who don't have a technology background is overwhelming.
Yeah.
Right. The jargon messes them up. All the terms. Hey, instead just explain to them. Hey, this is what we're trying to do, and here's how this tool will benefit you.
Yeah.
Let me show you how it works, and make it less intimidating for people.
And it's interesting because on the one hand, you absolutely have people who are intimidated by technology, don't understand it and all that, and yet give them their phone and they will run rings around being able to do all of these incredibly complicated things and stuff that I can't do with my phone. But then talk to them about how to use Office or Excel or the like, and now suddenly they don't know or understand it. Right. So I think part of the challenge also is we have to be willing to teach our people at least an introductory level about here are some of the opportunities that we have. Here are some of the tools that we do have the ability to do stuff with. If you had these tools, what would you do to make your job easier?
Right. Yeah. I forget where I read it, but there was a study done someplace in Africa where there was no technology. There was nothing. People they didn't even have radio or TV.
Yeah.
But they were able to make a quantum leap when they were introduced to technology that we're using today, even though they had no previous background, because they weren't intimidated or they
had no previous background.
Right. So it was much easier for them to make that leap.
Yeah.
And now, of course, by this point, they're like we are, and anything new is new.
Right.
When you don't have, that's why like kids can adapt to things so quickly, because you see a baby in a high chair using an iPad, and it's like that's incredible, but that's all they've ever known.
Yeah.
It's not to them. It's not technology.
Absolutely. But I think one of the responsibilities on the part of management, and this is one, and it's odd. So I'm going to a bit of a plug from a Simplex-IT standpoint. For our clients, both the co-managed and managed clients, we include a ton of educational resources. Like 500 online courses to learn how to better use Excel or data communication, business intelligence, so on and so forth. It is really, really tough to get them to use it. It is easy for them to, and people will say, including management and leadership, will say, wow, it's great that resource is there.
Right.
But they don't actually consume the resource or give people learning plans or the like. Because again, it gets back to that whole, I've got so much to do already.
Right.
You're giving me this additional work to do.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. I mean, people find their way to move through things that can really help them. I know if you work for a large company, every year there's 4 or 5 things you have to do online, and they're supposed to take an hour and a half or 2 hours. And people in the office always talk about how they got through it in 30 minutes because they're guessing on the answers. They go back, it tells them it's wrong, and they fill in. But they're not learning anything, and they're not using the information to help their team or to help themselves. Yeah. So it's a huge challenge. There's so much information out there that you can YouTube, right, to learn about things that it is a challenge to get people to use it, and to understand it. Yeah.
One of the things that I like doing, and I've done this in some prior jobs, and is to basically create skunk work projects, and these are small projects that you don't tell management about. You just do it, and you find a small group of champions, people who are going to say, "Yeah, I love that." Hey, obviously, you're not doing anything wrong or unethical or the like, but hey, let's all learn how to do this. Because if you can find a couple of people who will say, "Yeah, I want to get better at using Word for list processing or Excel to update databases or whatever," and you get together and you start showing, this stuff's pretty cool. This stuff actually is making my life easier. You'll have people ultimately looking over your shoulder and go, wow, I didn't know you could do that.
Right.
And they'll kind of buy into it. Now, I think it's much better when you get management to buy into that from the get-go. But I found that there are sometimes where peer pressure actually can come in. Now, peer pressure can also be used to talk people out of doing it.
Right.
But I like to try to do that to get people to accept and change.
Yeah, and sometimes the tools, they're already there. You don't need to invest in
Absolutely.
anything new. And it could be as easy as, we don't have a good way of scheduling how our shop is going to produce things.
Right.
And, it might be bringing somebody in from finance who's an expert at Excel and saying, hey, here's our problem.
Yeah.
Here's what we're trying to do. Can you work with, Joe or Jane to they'll tell you what they're trying to do. We just don't know how to do it in Excel. And can you create something that's really going to help us, schedule what we need to do to get through our day?
And that's actually, it's a great idea. I like the idea of finding, especially, we love to show off as human beings.
Right.
So if you know somebody who's really, really good at using a tool, you basically say, hey, we'll buy you pizza.
Right.
The universal, economy of geeks.
Right.
We'll bring you in for lunch, whatever. Just show us what you got.
Yeah, it's helpful. And that's all automation at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right? Automation doesn't have to be overcomplicated.
Right.
It can be what we already have, and just bringing in somebody new who doesn't know anything about what you're trying to do, but they're an expert with that tool that the company already has.
Right. And the other thing that you can do is to bring them in for that simple solution that can serve as this is an example of what we could have done if we invested some money in it.
Yep. And it also exposes other people in the organization to what can be, and ignite a spark in that person to go out there and do some things on their own.
Absolutely.
So it's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And the opportunities are constantly expanding. And in some cases, the opportunities are there to do things that your organization has never done before.
Right.
So to sum this up, we got the defining processes, documenting procedures, all that. And we've also talked about automation. An organization is sitting here not sure where to go next. What should they do?
I think it comes back to kind of your tabletop or whiteboard example, is really to sit down, maybe with a facilitator or just the team that's there, and say, hey, what are what's holding us back?
Cool.
Why can't we go to that next level?
Cool. And
starting with that.
And as a facilitator goes, is that something that, I don't know, you do?
Yeah, that's something that
Really?
I do.
What a shock.
Help companies with that. And I can ask a lot of dumb questions that everyone around the table might want to ask, but they'd be embarrassed to. But I got nothing to lose because I legitimately don't know.
No.
And sometimes it's just a matter of enabling people to open up in a safe zone.
Absolutely.
And to get the ball rolling for them.
Cool. People want to reach out and connect with you. How do they do it?
I'm the only Paul DiPronio on LinkedIn, so I'm easy to find there. And so
This is how we met.
That's right. That's the best place to find me and reach out to me. I'm glad to connect and have a conversation with you.
Cool. And you had a couple of insightful posts on LinkedIn, and which I responded to one, and that's how this whole conversation happened and all that sort of stuff. So
right.
Appreciate
you doing that.
Yeah, whether or not my posts are any good, that's another topic entirely. So cool. Take a look at Paul's profile, reach out to him on LinkedIn and all that. And obviously, any comments, any questions, there is an overwhelming need for more comments on the internet. I saw a post recently that said that the internet might break if there aren't enough people liking and subscribing and commenting to things. And I, for one, don't want to be responsible for the destruction of the internet. I don't think you want to be either. So let's hear from you, and let's hear from you soon. Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Bob Coppedge, Crotchety Old Geek. Catch you next time.